The sound of my body hitting the floor at Christmas dinner was not the worst part. The worst part was the silence that followed. 23 family members were sitting around that table, and not a single one of them helped me up. Not even my mother. My name is Simona Cunningham. I am 29 years old, and until that December night, I thought I knew what rock bottom looked like. I was wrong. Rock bottom has a basement, and it smells like my stepfather's cologne mixed with pine needles and betrayal. Before I continue, I want to say thank you to everyone listening. If you can, please like this video and leave a comment telling me where you are watching from. Your support means more than you know. Now let me take you back to Christmas Eve at the annual Cunningham-Morrison family gathering. You know the type. Matching sweaters that nobody actually wants to wear. Enough food to feed a small army, and family tensions simmering just beneath the surface like badly seasoned gravy. Frank had been my stepfather for 10 years. But that night, he was in rare form. He had been drinking his so-called special vintage wine since noon. I happened to know it was just Trader Joe's wine poured into a fancy decanter. Still, he acted like a connoisseur. All evening, he kept making small comments about how I was sitting in premium real estate at the dinner table, about how some people earn their place, while others just inherit it. My cousin Jennifer kept looking at me, her expression clearly asking what his problem was tonight. I tried to ignore it. I stared at the grandfather clock in the living room, avoiding eye contact, counting the seconds until dinner would be over. Then everything changed. The front door burst open with dramatic flair, the kind only my stepsister Brittany could manage. She arrived late, as always, carrying designer shopping bags, despite having claimed bankruptcy just a month earlier. The moment Frank saw her, his entire face lit up. He looked like he was seeing a miracle. What happened next still plays in slow motion in my mind. Frank stood up from his seat. He walked directly over to me. I was sitting in the same chair I had occupied for 29 years. The same chair my late father used to call Simona's throne. Frank announced to the entire table that his real daughter needed a proper place to sit. I did not move fast enough. Without warning, he grabbed my chair while I was still sitting in it and yanked it backward. I tried to stand, but my legs got tangled in the tablecloth. I lost my balance and fell hard. My hips slammed into the hardwood floor. My dress tore. Cranberry sauce flew across the table. But none of that was the worst part. The worst part was what came next. Silence. 23 people sat there, watching, like they were witnessing a dinner theater performance. My grandmother let out a small gasp, the same sound she usually made when someone used the wrong fork. My Uncle Ted had already pulled out his phone. He was recording everything, probably thinking it would be funny to post online. My mother's face was frozen. She wore the same expression she had perfected over the years, the one that said she saw nothing, heard nothing, and would say nothing. As I struggled to pull myself up from the floor, cranberry sauce staining my grandmother's vintage dress, I heard Frank mutter that I should be grateful I was even invited. That was the moment something inside me changed. As I stood there, humiliated and shaking, I noticed something important. Frank's business phone was sitting unlocked on the kitchen counter. In my world of corporate compliance, we have a word for moments like that. Opportunity. I left that house with my dignity in pieces. But I left with something else intact. My father's old laptop was hidden safely in my car. And I had photos of every single message on Frank's phone. Frank thought he had just pushed around a nobody. He had no idea that sometimes, the nobody knows everything. To understand why that single push meant everything, you need to understand what the 10 years before that night really looked like. To understand why that push mattered so much, you need to know what the previous 10 years of my life looked like. Frank Morrison entered our lives like a knight in shining armor. If that armor came from a men's warehouse store, and if knights drove leased luxury cars they could barely afford. My mother had been widowed for 2 years when Frank appeared at our church's Widows and Widowers group. Looking back, his presence there felt less like coincidence and more like a wolf attending a sheep support meeting. He focused on my mother quickly. Faster than my stepsister Brittany burned through credit cards. At first, the favoritism was subtle. When Brittany turned 18, Frank bought her a brand new car. When I turned 18, Frank gave me a bus pass and a lecture about self-sufficiency. At the time, I laughed. I honestly believed he was trying to teach me responsibility. The joke, it turned out, was on me. Things became clearer when college came around. Before my father died, he had set up education funds for me. I remembered seeing the account statements when I was younger, but when I tried to access those funds, they were gone. Frank explained it away with one phrase: market volatility. At the same time, he somehow found tens of thousands of dollars to pay for Brittany's private art school tuition. She dropped out before finishing her degree and decided she wanted to become an influencer. Her social media following barely reached a few hundred people, most of them fake accounts. During those years, my mother changed too. She went from being a woman who organized charity events and commanded respect to becoming Frank's echo. Whatever Frank thinks is best became her favorite phrase. She repeated it so often, it felt like she was a pull-string doll programmed with only a few responses. The deepest betrayal came next. The family business my father had built from nothing, a small but profitable logistics company, slowly slipped into Frank's control. While my mother was still grieving, Frank convinced her to make him the CEO. I watched him sit in my father's office, lean back in my father's chair, and use my father's golf clubs like trophies he had earned. But there was something Frank never realized. I was watching. 3 years into their marriage, I noticed discrepancies in the company's financial records during a family dinner when Frank had left his laptop open. 5 years in, I saw property transfers that did not make sense. 7 years in, I stopped trusting coincidences and started keeping copies of everything. The warning came quietly. During Thanksgiving the year before the incident, my grandmother pulled me aside in the kitchen. She pressed a small USB drive into my hand. She told me it contained my father's old laptop files, the ones stored in the garage. She warned me not to let Frank know I had it. She said there were things on it that Frank should have told me before my father died. Then she calmly went back to basting the turkey, as if she had not just handed me something that could destroy a man. As Brittany failed at one job after another, Frank grew bolder. She wanted to be a fashion designer, then a party planner, then a life coach. Each failure cost thousands of dollars. And every time, that money came from the company my father built. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Brittany failed. Frank complained about ungrateful people. And somehow, more money appeared to fund her next disaster. Meanwhile, I was working 60-hour weeks in corporate compliance. I took night classes to earn my CPA, and I still had to listen to how Brittany was the future of the family. By the time Christmas Eve arrived, the truth had already been forming beneath the surface. I just did not realize yet how violently it was about to break through. Christmas night ended with me sitting alone in my apartment, an ice pack pressed against my hip and anger burning in my chest. The champagne I had brought for the family toast sat unopened on the counter. That night, humiliation did not pair well with celebration. It paired better with coffee and rage. I pulled out my father's old laptop, the one I had hidden in my closet for nearly a year. I had been too afraid to open it before, afraid of what I might find, afraid of what I might not find. The USB drive my grandmother had given me felt heavier than it should have. That night felt like the right time. The password was my birthday. My father had been brilliant in many ways, but he had always been terrible with passwords. When the screen loaded, my hands began to shake. There were email archives going back 15 years, folders labeled insurance for Simona, and one folder that made my stomach drop. If something happens, the first discovery hit like ice water. My father's real will was there. It included specific protections I had never seen before. The family business was supposed to be held in trust until I turned 30. Mandatory distributions were supposed to begin years earlier. The house was never meant to be transferred into Frank's name. There were safeguards, clauses, legal barriers designed to protect everything. So where had this will been during probate? I remembered Frank's unlocked phone on the kitchen counter. I opened the photos I had taken earlier that night. His text messages told a story more dramatic than anything I had ever seen on television. Brittany owed large amounts of money to people whose names made my skin crawl. The totals were staggering. Frank had been juggling creditors like a desperate performer. Then I found what changed everything. Messages between Frank and a man named Carl detailed plans to restructure company assets. Inventory was being moved offshore, shell companies were being created, loans were being taken out using the family business as collateral. Those loans were funding Brittany's lifestyle. In my profession, we have a word for this: fraud. My phone began to buzz. The family group chat had exploded. My uncle had posted the video of my fall. He had filled it with laughing emojis. But the response was not what he expected. Family members began calling the post disgusting. Some demanded he take it down. My cousin Jennifer called me directly. She told me she worked as a paralegal handling foreclosure cases, and she had seen something familiar: our mother's house. It was on a preliminary foreclosure list. Frank had taken out multiple mortgages without telling anyone. The house my father had built with his own hands was about to be lost to pay for Brittany's failed businesses. That was the moment I stopped reacting and started acting. I opened my laptop and began writing. Every email I sent was scheduled for early morning delivery. I wrote to Frank's business partners, to the tax authorities, to the state attorney general, to Brittany's creditors, and finally, to my mother. Each message included documentation, financial records, evidence, proof. I attached my uncle's video where appropriate. I wanted them to see exactly who Frank was. I fell asleep exhausted and woke before dawn. I made coffee and sat in my father's old reading chair. And I waited. The explosion began quickly. Frank's phone started ringing nonstop. I could hear it from my apartment. He lived only a few floors above me. Calls stacked on top of calls. In the family group chat, Frank sent a single message asking what I had done. Seconds later, he tried to delete it. Too late. Screenshots spread instantly. The video of my fall had escaped the family group. It had been shared publicly and was spreading fast. By morning, Frank's carefully controlled world was already cracking. And this was only the beginning. 3 days after Christmas, just when I thought Frank had finally collapsed, he struck back. I was sitting in my apartment, surrounded by legal documents, when my doorbell rang early in the morning. This time, it was not Frank. It was professional. The man standing outside looked like a lawyer pulled straight from a casting call. Silver hair, an expensive suit, and a smile polished by years of intimidation. His name was Richard Steinberg. He handed me a stack of papers with theatrical confidence. Frank was suing me for millions. The charges were corporate espionage, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. That last accusation almost made me laugh. Frank claimed I had abused my position in corporate compliance to steal confidential information. He accused me of violating agreements and deliberately destroying his business. He even found 2 former co-workers of mine, both fired for fraud, who were willing to testify that I had bragged about taking him down. The strategy was calculated and dangerous. Frank had hired a public relations campaign to reshape the narrative. Suddenly, I was no longer the woman pushed to the floor at Christmas dinner. I was being portrayed as a jealous stepdaughter who had fabricated evidence to destroy a hardworking family man. Then Brittany appeared. She showed up at my apartment with a camera crew. Not news media, a documentary team. She stood in the hallway pretending to cry, claiming I had always resented her success and that I was the true villain. The story spread quickly. Videos were edited to make it look like I had thrown myself to the floor. The internet embraced the conspiracy. Within days, I was receiving death threats from strangers who had decided I was evil. My employer placed me on administrative leave while they conducted an internal investigation. Neighbors began whispering. Family members began doubting. Even my mother called me, her voice uncertain. She asked if the documents Frank's lawyer showed her were real. She asked if I had planted evidence. That question hurt more than the fall at Christmas dinner. Frank went on local television. He wore his best suit and spoke softly about betrayal, family, and forgiveness. He claimed he had raised me like his own daughter and that all he wanted was peace. The hosts nodded sympathetically. No one questioned him. Meanwhile, Richard Steinberg was proving why he had a reputation. He argued that accessing Frank's unlocked phone could legally be considered unauthorized access. He reframed my documentation as obsession. He suggested I had manipulated my elderly grandmother. The hearing date was set. Frank had momentum. Public sympathy was shifting, and I was starting to wonder if I had played my hand too early. The night before the hearing, I sat alone with my father's laptop, staring at the screen, questioning every decision I had made. It felt like the entire story was about to be rewritten, but I did not yet know that the truth was about to surface in a way no one could stop. The day before the hearing, everything changed again. This time, Frank's carefully constructed narrative collapsed completely. It began with the man handling his public image. The reputation consultant Frank had hired was working out of his mother's basement, and it turned out his mother recognized Frank. She remembered him from a book club years earlier, in another state, under a different name. He had scammed several widows and disappeared. She did not just call the police, she called every woman she knew from that group. By midday, multiple victims had come forward, all telling the same story. Different names, same man. At the same time, the two former coworkers who had agreed to testify against me were visited by federal investigators. Faced with real consequences, they admitted Frank had paid them to lie. They turned over messages, payment records, and instructions. Then came the most unexpected betrayal. Richard Steinberg's paralegal. She had been quietly recording meetings, legally, in a state that allowed one-party consent. Frank had been careless. He spoke openly about fabricating evidence, bribing witnesses, and planning to flee the country once he secured a settlement. The paralegal took everything to the district attorney. Hours of recordings, transcripts, proof. While all of this unfolded, the documentary filmmaker following Brittany captured something critical. Brittany admitted on camera that she knew her father was guilty. She said it did not matter as long as the money kept coming. She also mentioned Frank's side business, selling fake luxury goods, using the family warehouse for storage. That evening, Frank appeared at my door again. This time, he was alone. He begged. He offered money. First a small amount, then more, then everything he had. I recorded the entire conversation. My mother arrived while he was still pleading. She had spent the day with my grandmother reviewing old documents, recordings, and files. They discovered something devastating. My father had suspected Frank long before his death. He had hired a private investigator. He had gathered evidence. He had hidden it. That night, after Frank finally left, I opened a folder on my father's laptop I had been avoiding. It was labeled simply for my daughter. Inside was a video. My father appeared on the screen, thinner from illness but steady and calm. He explained that if I was watching the video, it meant Frank had revealed himself. He apologized for not being able to protect me himself, but said he had left me the tools to protect myself. He revealed that Frank's real identity was different, that he had been running the same scam across multiple states for decades. Then came the truth that changed everything. The will Frank thought he destroyed was never real. The real one had been filed elsewhere and could not be altered. The accounts Frank controlled were monitored. The house was placed in a trust designed to activate under specific conditions. My father explained that federal investigators had been watching Frank for years. The woman Frank believed was his mistress was actually an undercover agent. They had been waiting for Frank to make a final move. I ended the night on the phone with the agent my father mentioned. She told me they were ready. Frank had crossed every remaining legal line. The arrest would happen the next morning. The morning arrived with snow in the air and sirens in the distance. Federal agents arrested Frank at dawn. He was not dressed in confidence or power. He was wearing borrowed clothes and panic. Brittany screamed about her rights. The public relations consultant was there as well, having spent the night trying to control damage that was no longer controllable. The hearing scheduled for that morning never became a hearing. Instead, it became an emergency proceeding to freeze assets. Federal agents presented years of evidence, financial records, recordings, witness testimony. The undercover agent who had posed as Frank's secretary testified. She detailed the fraud, the money laundering, and the international connections. She also revealed something that made the courtroom fall silent. Frank had planned to interfere with my father's medication, a plan he abandoned only because my father was already dying. Frank's lawyer attempted to withdraw from the case. He failed. Recordings showed he had knowingly participated in witness tampering. His law license was suspended. Victims from across the country took the stand. Widows, mothers, families. Each told the same story under different names. Frank was not an exception. He was a pattern. The charges multiplied. Tax fraud, wire fraud, racketeering, money laundering. The amount he owed in back taxes alone was staggering. Bail was denied. Every asset was frozen. Frank was no longer in control of anything. While this unfolded, my mother testified. She did not defend Frank. She spoke calmly and clearly. She said she had been grieving and he had been hunting. The courtroom went quiet. Brittany testified next. Faced with her own charges, she told the truth. She confirmed the scams, the lies, the stolen money. Her testimony sealed what was already inevitable. Frank was sentenced to decades in federal prison. No early release. No escape. The man who pushed me to the floor was now falling with no one left to catch him. New Year's Eve came quietly. The family gathered again, this time without fear. The silence that filled the room was not complicity, it was reflection. My mother apologized to me directly, not for being deceived, but for choosing comfort over courage. She said I deserved protection, not patience. My grandmother reminded everyone that silence in the face of injustice is a choice. At midnight, the trust activated. The business my father built was officially mine. The house was mine. The safeguards worked. Frank's story ended in a cell. Mine continued. Months later, the business recovered and thrived. Employees were treated with respect. Profits were shared. The family began to heal. A foundation was created to help other victims escape similar abuse. Frank became a cautionary tale. I visited him once, not for forgiveness, but to show him a photograph of the Christmas table. My seat was there, the same seat. I told him it had never been about hierarchy. It had always been about family. And he had never been family. A year after that night, we gathered again. The table was full. Laughter replaced fear. Justice had not come from revenge. It came from balance. Frank pushed me down in front of silent witnesses. That single act of cruelty became the first domino in his destruction. He thought he was pushing a weak stepdaughter. Instead, he pushed the truth. And the truth never stays down. Thank you for listening to my story.